From the University of Notre Dame, these are Notre Dame Stories. In this episode, Preparing for the Future, we look at the future of work and how technology may disrupt the modern marketplace. And for generations, indigenous people living in the Amazon basin have produced a common food staple, how Mendoza College of Business students are helping to ensure they'll continue to do so for generations to come.
Well, I tell people, first of all, I think not to assume this dystopian view that this is going to be disruptive and destructive in ways that do not allow for a future for you or for your offspring, but rather take a more active position that this is a transition that needs to be managed and that we need our leaders, be they political leaders, be they business leaders, be they civil society leaders, educational leaders, to get on top of this issue quickly, because the real issue for all of us is, can society keep up with the technology?
Ray Offenheiser is the Distinguished Professor of the Practice and Director of the Notre Dame Initiative for Global Development. Is it your sense that people maybe don't understand just how pervasive the change that is on the horizon can be? And if so, could you give us maybe an overview of the breadth and depth of this shift that we're talking about?
Well, I think most people have become aware that Uber is a new reality, and many people are taking advantage of it, and that's, I think, one very clear example. And then of the use of big data and artificial intelligence to kind of create new ways of doing things. But we see it in smaller ways. Just when you go to the CVS and you see that the cashier has disappeared, and now you're checking out on your own, or you go to Home Depot and you see the same thing. There used to be cashiers in those roles, and there's 3 million cashiers in the United States. And so if we imagine a world in which the role of a cashier becomes an anachronism and disappears, that's 3 million jobs potentially that may disappear rather quickly. So I think people are beginning to feel it and perceive it, but not necessarily understand it. And I think one of the interesting things at the current moment is there's an assumption that the issue of American jobs in the United States and loss of jobs has been largely owing to trade and the loss of jobs to countries overseas. But actually, there's one estimate that 4 out of 5 jobs are actually been already lost to automation, not necessarily to trade. And so I think more and more this is going to become central to the kind of debates we're having in the country. I think one of the things that's actually changed the conversation of late and has, in some sense, drawn this more into the public domain and gotten political leaders at various levels working on it, thinking about it. And it's certainly got corporate executives thinking about it. For the corporate executives, it's about lowering costs and being more competitive. I think for political leaders, it's about the potential for social disruption as a consequence of labor market disruptions across their economies. What I think is being perceived now is the original estimates were that, yes, this is going to happen, but it will unfold rather gradually, and probably we won't feel the effects of it until 2050, the middle of this century. But now I think the reality is that people are realizing that self-driving cars are already on the road. Now we're hearing reports of accidents. We're hearing loss of life as a consequence of an accident with an automated automobile or a self-driving automobile. So the current estimate is that we're going to see a lot of these changes a lot faster and a lot quicker than we had imagined. So there's some ways an acceleration in the rate of change that probably we're not prepared for and that we need to kind of get on top of quickly. And let me just give you one particular example. I was at a meeting of a large mining company a few weeks ago, and they were having an internal conversation about the future of work and how it was going to affect their company and the communities in which they ran massive mines in various parts of the world, and how they were having to roll out, or they were planning to roll out, large investments in automating their technology. Now, what does that mean on a mine site? Well, for open pit mines, it means that the 3-story high trucks that drive deep into open pit mines that are loaded with ore and then are driven to processing plants, and oftentimes there are scores and scores of these trucks that are operating in these pit mines, they're going to be moved to being automated vehicles. And in the case of this particular company, that is going to happen. Well, it's happening right now in a pilot basis in one particular mine, where they've introduced this and they're experimenting with what it means and how well does it work, and do the trucks stay on the road, and can they be coordinated in complex arrangements during the course of a day, and can that all be managed by in a faraway location from someone sitting in front of a computer screen in Melbourne, Australia, and now they're thinking, well, okay, we may have figured out how to deal with all the technology, but then what does that mean for the community in which we may do this, and for the jobs that would be lost there, and what's our responsibility to that broader community in terms of thinking about this transition and maybe preparing that community for that transition. That whole process could be rolled out over the next 5 to 6 years, and that will transform the way that particular mining corporation might be operating. So these are these are conversations that are already underway, and the technology is there to make it happen. And so I think it's timely that we're starting to talk about these conversations in conferences and in various other kinds of fora.
You mentioned mining industry. You mentioned cashiers. Is there another sector of the economy or of society that may be most impacted by this shift?
When we look at this, we tend to think, well, this is going to really be about working class people. This is going to be about the cashiers. This is going to be about the truck drivers on Route 90 crisscrossing the country. This is going to be about people operating large machinery or operating on an assembly line in a factory. The reality, however, is that this is going to be about paralegals. This is going to be about lawyers. This is going to be about stock traders. This is going to be about the financial industry. This is going to be about white-collar jobs. That reality has not dawned on this country yet, and this has not dawned on the wider population, that this is going to be ubiquitous. It's going to affect every single sector, and it's going to affect those sectors dramatically. And what is, in some sense, discussed in the circles where this is really being looked at is a world in which we will all, in theory, have more leisure, but there will be fewer jobs. There'll be lots of sort of jobs in sort of technical fields that are in support of these new approaches that are using the big data and that are in some sense driving these big systems. But the more traditional jobs that have been part of the industrial economy will disappear. And then the question is, what jobs will replace them? And there is a consensus that there will be new jobs emerging out of this new digital economy, but they'll be very different and they'll require different kinds of skills. And the question is, are we preparing people with the right skills for those new jobs? And we don't even know what those jobs are, so it's hard to know how to prepare people for those jobs. Mm-hmm. So it's a moment of tremendous transition. We're at an inflection point as a society and maybe as civilization on a global level. And I think we need to, take a close look at this and figure out how we prepare.
Is there a part of the world where we're starting to see this shift maybe accelerate a little more rapidly than at large? And what are lessons that maybe can be learned there?
I think in most of the world it's unfolding as it's unfolding here, where it's visible to us on a daily basis when we walk into a shop or we, hear a news report about an autonomous vehicle or we take Uber. But I don't think we've really grasped the fact that the technology is there to drive this on a much more accelerated basis. The one place where I think they have taken it on board and are really driving it as part of national policy is China, which seems a bit paradoxical in one sense, because there you have this enormous population, and you'd presume, it's a country that's, been bringing millions of people out of poverty, and you would have thought there'd be a large labor surplus, so the last thing you'd want to be doing would be accelerating automation. But the Chinese are doing precisely that, and to some degree, that has to do with the fact that their labor costs have been going up, and there are other countries with lower labor costs that are competing with them in a variety of different areas that in the past where they were perhaps dominant, textile being one of them. But they also have decided, they want to be a leader in technology on a global level, and they want to be, designing and building the technology of the future for the global marketplace. So the leadership of China has decided to go full bore into rapid scale automation, and some commentators might, argue that they're doing this, wisely in terms of economic policy, but there may be social consequences for the rate at which they're doing it, and for the fact that there is this potential for disrupting the labor market to such a degree that you then end up with a kind of a disenfranchised group of workers who really can't find their way back into kind of meaningful work and meaningful jobs.
Mm-hmm. And that, of course, would be a reason for concern, not just in China, but everywhere where this disruption takes place. Is there also reason for optimism? I mean, anytime you talk about changing the way someone works and potential shifts in the way they make a living, that sparks concern. Is there a reason to be hopeful and optimistic about this shift?
Well, I think the upside of this kind of technological change is, if we look back at the kinds of jobs people have had over the last 2 to 3 centuries, there's been a lot of drudgery, there's been a lot of child labor, there's been a lot of really challenging jobs where there have been health consequences. People's length of life has been relatively short because of how arduous the work is that they've been doing. So, in some sense, technology will make work easier, and we will be living in a world where, at least the technologists would say, we could potentially have more leisure. In other words, there's talk in some quarters about maybe we should institutionalize the 4-day work week. So this, the idea would be, that if we could build a society which could have a 4-day work week and have full employment and meaningful employment, then, this could work out to be quite good. I think the real question, though, is how are societies going to prepare to reorganize themselves to manage this? And if you think a little bit, if you make a comparison with the Industrial Revolution, you have to realize that, the Industrial Revolution probably began in the 1820s, 1830s in Europe. And out of that, the social sciences really grew in some sense as a response to the disruption of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, in some sense, was implemented over, say, 120-year period. It was a relatively slower rollout than what we're going to see with this rollout. So I think what we have to do, in many ways, is think about what are those societal changes that are going to have to accompany the technological changes, and think a lot about how people will interact with the technology. How will people interact with robots? What are the sort of complementary opportunities for people to have meaningful work in a world where work is being made simple, it's being less onerous, if I can put it that way, and there's opportunities still to have what you might call decent work and a decent livelihood at all levels of a society with some degree of equality.
Talk to us about the Future of Work conference coming up here on campus in June. What is that event? How will you be addressing this kind of broad question about what the future of work looks like?
Well, much of the discussion about the future of work in its initial phases has been about this the disruptive effects of it and the potential for, if you will, a dystopian future. Then the other version is the sort of a technology vision of the world in which we will all benefit from the availability of this technology. We will have more leisure, and we'll live in a gig economy where we can have the leisure we need, and we can all become entrepreneurs, and we can kind of build the work life that we want around the interests that we may have. I think now there's a sort of a sobering up of this kind of the conversation and a coming together, if you will, of the technology people with the labor movement, with the sort of social policy people, to think a little bit more about how do we manage the transition. Let's presume that this is going to be somewhat of the equivalent of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, and it's going to carry on through the 21st century, and that it's going to be disruptive, and that and let's take that as a given. Let's try to identify how it's going to be disruptive and what are some of the ethical questions that will arise inevitably from this disruption. What are some of the social impact questions that we need to grapple with? What are some of the social policy issues that we need to be thinking of, preemptively in some ways to prepare for this? What are the things we need to be thinking about in terms of educating a labor force in a different way? What is it we need to be thinking about in terms of how education and the educational institutions of today, which were designed for an industrial era, need to be redesigned for a digital era? And maybe the models of education and the very structures of education that we have today need to be completely rethought to prepare the workforce of the future to be systems thinkers, to be comfortable in a world of artificial intelligence and big data, that are comfortable with the sort of coding and design issues that come with that, and that are comfortable thinking about the complementarities in terms of what human intelligence can offer relative to sort of artificial intelligence, and how those two worlds come together to make a better and more equitable world. This conference is in some sense trying to say, we are welcoming the digital age. We acknowledge that it's a reality, but we want to manage the transition intelligently. And we want to make sure that the society is evolving at a pace that keeps up with the technological change and keeps up with the ethical issues and the social policy questions that are going to be front and center for our leadership in the coming years, and that we're going to be bringing together government, business, civil society leaders to talk about these things together, so that in some sense we are operating with a shared vision.
You've just kind of outlined it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What makes this, the future of work, a Notre Dame issue, or something that Notre Dame and maybe specifically the Keough School of Global Affairs is well suited to take on?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about where this conversation began is in the technology centers on the coasts. But what I don't think has happened is that these conversations have not come to the middle of the country where manufacturing is done. It hasn't come to the heartland in quite the same way. And so here we are in Indiana. And Indiana is a state with a very high percentage of manufacturing as a percent of annual revenue, and obviously probably of the tax base for the state. So it's a state where this issue should be quite relevant, or is quite relevant. If you look at the state, in many ways, there's there is some heavy manufacturing and some advanced manufacturing, but a lot of the state is smaller scale tool and die shops. What you might call sort of medium scale manufacturing. And these are the kinds of operations that, with automation, could actually be transformed relatively quickly, and perhaps even relatively inexpensively, relative to, say, a large steel mill or a large, advanced manufacturing or operation. And so in some ways, it behooves, I think, the leadership in Indiana to be taking this on board early, and thinking about, how is it going to, to enter and transform the economy in this kind of a state with a heavy manufacturing commitment. And so here we are at Notre Dame, where, we are one of the major institutions in the northern part of the state. I think it's probably, appropriate for a university of our scale to be with a large engineering capacity and a commitment to a sort of ethical thinking about human development, and a first-class business school, where all the different components of this are likely to be discussed, and frankly, over the last year or so, have had a presence on the campus, to begin to take this on in a more robust way. And I think the role of universities in this at this moment is really important, and it's an important area for us to think about. One hypothesis about it is that there will be so many changes happening so fast that the traditional model of education from the industrial era and previous will not be able to keep up with it unless we imagine a world in which universities are playing a role of continuous education. And that the sort of the 4-year model of, you get your degree and then you start a life in which those skills are going to carry you forward for the next 50 years, they may not be the way we live in the future, and that actually we may need to constantly be renewing our skill sets so that we stay relevant for a job market in which these new jobs are being created and new skills are going to be required to assume those kinds of roles. The real issue for all of us is, can society keep up with the technology? And society will keep up with the technology if we're having the conversation about managing the transition effectively. And that's what, at Notre Dame, we're trying to do through this conference. And we're hoping to continue that, to be a part of and to be a contributor to this conversation here in Indiana and nationally. And the extent to which these conversations become ubiquitous, I think we'll, as a society, will become more confident in our ability to manage this and manage this transition effectively, and not have the sort of dystopian world that some writers, both fiction writers and nonfiction writers, might predict. And so that's the encouragement that I'd give to folks, to assume an optimistic future and to work for it.
Ray Offenheiser, thank you very much.
Great to be with you.
I'm Stephen Meehan. I'm a second-year MBA student here at Mendoza and a member of the Business on the Front Lines class.
I am Sarah Chandler. I'm also a second-year Mendoza MBA student and a member of the Business on the Front Lines class, serving on Team Brazil.
Business on the Front Lines is a second-year MBA course in the Mendoza College of Business. It requires students to apply their training to help areas of the world recovering from conflict or dealing with generational poverty. Often, that means traveling what seems like a world away from campus. In this case, that meant a flight, a 2-hour boat trip, a ride in the back of a pickup transporting 31 people in a driving downpour, and a half-hour walk. But then, they were there. This was the Amazon.
I think that looking out over its expanse was amazing, and it looks like an ocean. It does not look like a river, it looks like a very, very, very large lake. Coming from the Midwest, it's very comparable, I think, to the Great Lakes. Business on the Front Lines is in the Amazon because we are partnering with a non-governmental organization called FAS, which is the Sustainable Amazon Foundation, and they work with communities along the Amazon trying to increase their household income and quality of life. We were specifically focusing on an Amazon flour that is essential and a staple on every table in Brazil, and this is something that they artisanally make as part of their day-to-day activities.
Espera ano e meio, tira tudo que tem de mandioca na terra e daí começa a fazer farinha tudo de uma vez.
The communities that we saw and visited, they're very committed to the area. It's very important that they do have a strong economy and access to markets because it increases their livelihood and makes their quality of life better. They are known as keepers of the forest and do receive a government stipend for that, but the more that they have access to markets and access to selling their own products, the less reliant they are on the government and the more reliant they are on themselves and their own livelihood.
And as these communities thrive, they become a stronger line of defense against deforestation of the Amazon rainforest they call home. A big part of their economic viability is the production and sale of farina, a yellowish flour-like ingredient with granules slightly thicker than cornmeal. Brazilians use it in baking or sprinkle it over other foods. The Mendoza students are acting as consultants of sorts to see if these communities can optimize their business.
It was really important for us, so as part of Business on the Front Lines, we spend 2 weeks in country, and that was absolutely critical. When you're dealing with organizations that don't have a strong history of record keeping or data keeping or a strong background in accounting, sometimes getting information can be difficult. So getting in country, speaking to people who actually purchase the product on a day-to-day basis, people who sell it, potential end customers, as well as the communities that actually make the product from harvest, peeling, grinding, toasting over a stove. It was incredibly important for us to understand the cultural aspect of producing farinha and all the work that went into each kilo of the product.
I think that a lot of the background academic research that we had done was really kind of confirmed in the country. What we didn't really kind of recognize was what a community-based activity this was. People came from neighboring communities to make farina. People came from neighboring cities. They were children that lived somewhere else but came back because they knew that the family was making farina that day. But it's a very social activity, and we really kind of saw that firsthand. And that tradition in honoring that artisanal production process is something that we wanted to continue to honor, and made sure that our recommendations really kind of stayed true to honoring that social, community-based activity.
The production is an extremely labor-intensive process. The students saw firsthand the physical toll making farina can take. Farina is made from the root of the cassava plant, which is actually naturally poisonous. To remove the toxins, the roots are soaked for days. Then water is pressed out using a giant 7-foot-long woven sleeve about the diameter of a basketball. The sleeves are stretched progressively tighter until finally the resulting dough is ready to use. From there, the product is toasted over a fire and then finally bagged and sent to market. At least, that's how one community does it. One of the challenges in this consulting work was learning that not every community does it the same way, so not every recommendation could be applied evenly, and that's far from the only challenge.
I think how it's different from a traditional project is, first, the language barrier. Only one member of our team spoke Portuguese, so that can tend to be a difficult sort of choke point where every piece of information you get tends to be in Portuguese, and you have to rely on one team member to put it into English for you. The other is just the availability of information. If you were to go into a consulting project with a Fortune 500 company, for example, you would probably get 10 years of financials and megabytes upon megabytes of data about every transaction they've ever had. That just doesn't exist in the Amazon. So you're dealing with stories and, some guy's notebook that somebody took a picture of with an iPhone when they were visiting. So it was definitely challenging from that perspective, just dealing with the ambiguity, the lack of information, and having to fill in when you were in country by asking around.
And I don't think when you're on site with your client, most are along the Amazon, or you're standing in 90 plus degree heat for the entire time that you're on an engagement. I think that was definitely a unique component of it.
When something is unique, it stands out, whether in an MBA course or on a supermarket shelf. The farina made by these communities is sold under a brand called Riverina, and seeing how it's made gave the students an idea for a differentiator in the marketplace.
The Riverina brand is really kind of wrapped up in a story, and the story of the Amazon is really what gives it the competitive advantage over comparable products and larger consumer packaged good driven products. So I think that's one thing that I took away that is really going to make this project really kind of stand out on the shelves, is the story, and that people of the Amazon make this product with their hands, and it's a time-tested artisanal process that goes into making this Guarani-style farina, and it's something that is very unique to the region, and you're really getting a taste of what it is to be in the Amazon when you eat it.
Yeah, so we made a series of recommendations, some around their financial management strategy to help the business become a little more profitable so that FOSS could end its financial subsidy and help the entrepreneurs become sustainable and self-reliant. And then we also made a series of recommendations implementing some technological changes that could help reduce some of the physical burden that we've spoken about before, reduce some of the back pain, maybe some of the lung or eye issues that we saw coming up again and again. And then we also made some simple recommendations about agricultural best practices, including just spacing of the plants and selecting the right plants. Really pretty simple, straightforward, easy to understand recommendations that they just hadn't quite thought about before.
I knew that Brazil was going to be very warm to us, but I didn't know that we were going to leave feeling like we were family with these people. I think, the views were just really kind of incredible, but I knew it was going to be lush, but I didn't realize how really lush the forests were going to be, and just really how to see that diversity in the Amazon. It was really cool, but I really think what truly makes the Amazon special is the people. When we were leaving the Amazon and pulling up the boat for the last time on our last community visit day, the Amazon said goodbye to us in an amazing way. We had a rainbow that we drove through to be able to dock the boat. So that was really a unique way to say goodbye to this experience.
Notre Dame Stories is produced by the Office of Public Affairs and Communications.